I move notice number 3 as amended, relating to ISIL's crimes against the Yazidis in the terms as circulated. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today I want to speak about the recent events that have occurred in Syria and Iraq with respect to Yazidis. The recent military defeat of ISIL allows for some reflection on the atrocities inflicted by Islamic extremism over the past 4 years in Syria and Iraq. In particular, the Yazidi people of northeastern Iraq have been subjected to extraordinary violence inflicted by ISIL. The Yazidi were actively hunted by ISIL. Massacres of civilians, including women and children, were widely reported as ISIL assaulted Iraq in 2014. They surrounded fleeing Yazidi on Mount Sinjar and attempted to starve them out. There have been many reports of surviving women and children also being abducted by ISIL forces and sold into slavery. The violence and horror of these stories appall me, as it should every member of this chamber. A 20-year-old woman beaten and raped multiple times a day for months, taking entire villages and shooting all but the young women, who were then sexually assaulted by ISIL fighters. Women, and indeed young girls, being sold and traded amongst ISIL fighters like objects. Survivors managed to flee any way they could, and some who have since resettled in Australia have told their story. I encountered the human face of one of these stories last year when I met and spoke with a Yazidi survivor, Nihad. At the age of 15, she was captured on the way to Mount Sinjar, fleeing from ISIL fighters. Her sister was raped in front of her, and she was sold to an ISIL fighter. She was then raped and beaten repeatedly. When the fighter died in combat, she was sold to a man she referred to as a monster, who kept her and other Yazidi girls as slaves. Nihad was further raped and beaten and then fell pregnant. Nihad gave birth to her son in July 2015. When she managed to escape, she was unable to take her young baby with her, and the baby was forced to remain with the father, a member of ISIL. She's never seen the baby again. Since listening to the horror inflicted on Nihad, I've also learnt some other stories of some Yazidi victims who have also settled here in Australia. Kudida Omar Kulo now lives in Toowoomba, but in 2014 his village was assaulted at 2 a.m. by ISIL, and he and his family had to flee 25 kilometres to Mount Sinjar while being fired upon. His brother and their family also fled, but did not arrive at the mountain. They have not been heard from since. Kudida and his family were trapped on Mount Sinjar for 9 days with little food or water. Due to their desperate situation, in order to escape, they decided to attempt to walk from Mount Sinjar to Kurdistan. Luckily, they came across a Kurdish convoy who were able to ferry them to a refugee camp. Furthermore, his daughter and 2 of his grandchildren were captured by ISIL and sold to a terrorist. Kudida spent months negotiating with the terrorist to flee his daughter and grandchildren and had to pay a ransom in order to free them. He then had to pay smugglers to rescue his daughter and grandchildren. Sadly, Kudida's story is not unique. Another man, now living in New South Wales, fled from an assault on his village with his wife and children. They spent 4 days trapped on Mount Sinjar with very little food and needing to walk 8 hours to get any water. To escape, they had to travel through ISIL-controlled areas to another town, Kursi, past victims and people dying from starvation and dehydration. After staying in Kursi for 3 days, this family tried to escape from Kursi into Syria. Thousands of Yazidi walked for hours in darkness with injuries, illness and bleeding feet to a Kurdish-controlled area. Such was their fear that when they first found Kurdish forces, people screamed in terror as they thought they had been found by ISIL. Instead, they finally received food, water and shelter and transport to freedom. Sadly, these stories are from survivors, those who have managed to escape from ISIL. Moreover, these are a small sample of the horrors suffered by the Yazidi. The Yazidi were specifically targeted by ISIL, forced from their homes, and if captured, they were often executed or sold into slavery. Many have labelled these crimes genocide, and this is what this motion here today presents to this Parliament, and I look forward to the further debate on this motion.
I thank the member for his contribution. Is there a seconder for the motion? The member for Canberra, are you seconding the motion?
Deputy Speaker.
And I give you the call to
Thank
speak.
you, Deputy Speaker. And I thank the member for Dunkley for bringing attention to this very important issue. Last September, I brought forward a similar private member's motion, Deputy Speaker, and I spoke strongly against the use of sexual violence in conflict and the need for the perpetrators of such violence and evil to be held account. I am a strong supporter of UN Resolution 1325 and the subsequent Women, Peace and Security resolutions that have followed in the recent years, Deputy Speaker, and I recently spoke at an event run by the Gender Institute and Centre for Military and Security Law for the Prosecute, Don't Perpetrate campaign. And I welcome the architect of the Prosecute, Don't Perpetrate campaign, Susan Hutchinson, who's in the chamber with us today, as we speak about this important issue that she has a very, very committed view, Deputy Speaker, on. And she's been a strong advocate on this issue for many years, Deputy Speaker. Now, the Prosecute, Don't Perpetrate campaign calls on governments to investigate and prosecute the sexual violence perpetrated by their own nationals who fought with Daesh in Syria and Iraq. Members of Daesh have committed sexual violence, have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. And these crimes are classified as such because the sexual violence, as perpetrated against the Yazidis, is with the intent to destroy. With the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the Yazidi community. In other words, genocide, Deputy Speaker. Now, at the Prosecute, Don't Perpetrate event last year, we were joined by Shireen and her friends and family who have recently settled in Australia as refugees from northern Iraq. Now, Shireen's family are from a village called Kocho in northern Iraq, where Daesh undertook a sweeping campaign killing thousands of Yazidis in August 2014. They kidnapped hundreds of women and girls who were sold into sexual slavery and buried the dead in mass graves. Shireen told her family's story in this very building, Deputy Speaker, as part of the official celebrations of World Refugee Day last year. She told how she'd been lucky to escape Kocho before Daesh came, but how some of her family, including her sister's husband and their children, were captured or killed. Now, from the back row of the event I spoke at last year, that event at the ANU, Deputy Speaker, Shireen and her friends and family, and there were many of them, were not only weeping for the pain of hearing about the part some Australians played in the suffering of their community and from the ongoing trauma of missing loved ones, but for the call to action that was very strong in that room, for their desire for recognition and justice for what they experienced. Last year, I passed that motion calling for the investigation and prosecution of Australians who perpetrated sexual violence as war crimes and crimes against humanity while fighting with terrorist groups like Daesh in Syria and Iraq. And today, we pass this motion, Deputy Speaker. We speak on this motion which condemns the genocide perpetrated against the Yazidi people by Daesh and calls for the continued support to investigate Australians who have allegedly perpetrated war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, including through the use of sexual violence, and prosecute them as appropriate. And to support international efforts to gather evidence, investigate and prosecute those responsible for international crimes perpetrated by Daesh in Iraq and Syria. Deputy Speaker, the 2016 UN Independent Commission of Inquiry on Syria recorded the gruesome details of crimes against the Yazidis. We know that women have suffered terribly. Women and girls have suffered terribly throughout the genocide, and survivors, including those now living in Australia, continue to grieve over their lost relatives and suffer flashbacks from their own torture. Australia has criminalised sexual violence as war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, but the last time an Australian court heard a case of war crimes was 1951, Deputy Speaker. 1951, that's a long time ago. This parliament has updated Australia's legislation on war crimes to ensure it applies to members of organisations such as Daesh. And when we ratified the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, we took on the responsibility of investigating war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, and prosecuting them in our own courts. Now, Deputy Speaker, is the time to take up that responsibility. We must gather the legal testimony of victims and witnesses to this genocide committed by Daesh, including the heinous use of sexual violence from the Yazidis who now call Australia home. We must include such evidence in investigations conducted by Australian authorities and share it with the international investigative mechanisms established in Syria and Iraq. I hope this motion, Deputy Speaker, acts towards the next step towards Australia pursuing justice for the victims of Daesh's heinous crimes.
Thank you. And I give the call. Sorry. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I give the call to the member for Cowan.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And might I start by commending the member for Dunkley for this motion, and I'm very happy to stand up and lend my voice to this motion. Might I also echo the member for Cowan in recognising the Prosecute Not Perpetrate campaign and Susan. It is a sad and unfortunate fact that the more vulnerable victims of conflict are women and children. It is a fact that women and girls suffer disproportionately during and after war. They are vulnerable particularly to sexual violence and exploitation, as well as other war crimes, Deputy Speaker. It was the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda which was the first to recognise rape and sexual violence as the crime of genocide. The tribunal found that sexual violence were constitutive elements of genocide in Rwanda. The UN Human Rights Council asserts that Daesh sought to destroy the minority Yazidis through killing, sexual slavery, enslavement, torture and other war crimes, confirming that Daesh's crimes against the Yazidis does indeed constitute genocide. Now, Deputy Speaker, it's easy to dismiss this as something far away that has no impact on us here in Australia, in our safe havens here in Australia, but there are implications here. Australia ratified the Genocide Convention, which requires us to enact legislation to penalise persons guilty of genocide. And in 1995, genocide became illegal in Australia. Our National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security is a vehicle. It's a vehicle for us to implement UN Security Council resolutions around sexual violence against women and girls. But we also have a more direct responsibility, Deputy Speaker. We have a responsibility to prosecute those who return from fighting in foreign conflicts in Iraq and Syria. We have a responsibility to prosecute those who have fought for Daesh for war crimes involving sexual violence and crimes against humanity and genocide. We cannot let this slide. We need to send a strong message that those who return to Australia after fighting with Daesh will not get away with the sexual violence they have perpetrated in conducting their heinous acts in Iraq and Syria. And I echo the sentiments previously expressed by the member for Canberra about the importance of ensuring that any prosecution that we conduct in relation to those who have returned as foreign fighters from Iraq and Syria should include an element of recognition of the sexual violence they perpetrated there. The other responsibility we have is to provide safe haven, for those persecuted minorities through our humanitarian policies, through supporting resettlement and through an effective and comprehensive settlement programs that include a recognition of the significant trauma that many of these minorities, particularly Yazidi women, have had to endure at the hands of Daesh. And we've heard so far today from the previous speakers personal accounts of those tragic stories. I note that in regard to that, some recent comments by those in the coalition that reflect a pattern of dog whistling against migrants and refugees. But this has a broader impact. It has a broader impact on the well-being and the successful settlement of those who have already suffered unspeakable trauma. And I would caution those who use arguments about population, who use arguments about our immigration, and who use arguments to draw attention to those others within our community who have come from, as our national anthem says, who have come across the seas to seek safe haven here in Australia. I would caution them to understand the broader impact of their words and understand the broader impact of their political opportunism in drawing attention to immigration and to refugees. We cannot be talking about genocide and prosecuting the guilty if we also aren't prepared to support the persecuted. And this is why the Prosecute, Don't Perpetrate campaign is so important. And I urge all members here today and all members in the House today to listen listen. Listen with open minds, listen with open hearts, and listen with open ears to the tragic tale of these women who have come here, and to support the Prosecute, Don't Perpetrate campaign.
Thank you. And I'm giving the call to the member.
Unexpected addition to the list.
Pardon me. Sorry. In the interest of fairness, I'll let other government members have a say here. And member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I apologise to the member for Monero for jumping ahead of him. Can I firstly congratulate the member for Dunkley for moving this important motion. I think we've heard during this debate some very moving and tragic accounts of some of the acts of horror and genocide that were perpetrated against the Yazidi, and I think it is important that this parliament consider these issues. It has been a long campaign by many in the international community, including Australia, to make sure that these horrors are properly recognised, but more importantly dealt with. Thankfully, the Australian government has already acted to help the Yazidi. The first part of this was through our contribution to the global coalition to defeat ISIL, as well as seeking to liberate Yazidis who may still be in captivity. But additionally, we've sought to help those that have been targeted. As such, hundreds of Yazidi survivors have already been settled in Australia as part of our resettlement program. And as part of that cohort of 12,000 refugees who fled the conflict in Syria and Iraq. Further, the Australian government is also seeking to fight slavery more broadly through the creation of the Modern Slavery Act, and I commend the member for Dunkley as chair of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on his work in this regard. However, these stories of horror that we've heard today alone cannot bring perpetrators to justice. The immediate aftermath of the defeat of ISIL should lead to an examination of these atrocities, in concert with the formation of an investigative team as already identified under UN Security Council Resolution 2379. The individual perpetrators of these crimes must be identified, investigated and brought to justice. I know that this is what organisers like Prosecute, not Perpetrate, Yazidi and other organisations working on behalf of Yazidis are trying to do. Such an investigation must be far-reaching in its conduct. While these are unspeakable horrors, to dismiss a fair and thorough investigation will not achieve justice for the Yazidi. As such, significant international support should go towards ensuring that the investigation has the resourcing it needs to investigate war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide against the Yazidi. Furthermore, this investigation will require an international component. There have been widespread reports of foreign fighters travelling to Syria and Iraq to assist ISIL, and unfortunately these have included some Australians amongst their numbers. As ISIL is defeated militarily, it is likely that these surviving fighters will flee, either to other conflicts or potentially attempting to return to their countries of origin. We cannot allow this to occur. This must also extend to those Australians who have fought for ISIL and who seek to return to Australia. These are people who have betrayed Australia and sought to represent a foreign force actively engaged in combat against Australian forces. Moreover, these people may very well have been complicit in some of the outrages inflicted upon the Yazidi. I have every confidence that the Australian government will investigate and prosecute any Australian involved in committing crimes against the Yazidi to ensure justice for victims and survivors of these atrocities. With the end of the conflict and the fall of Raqqa late last year, there is now an opportunity for both justice and recovery. Properly investigating and prosecuting these atrocities will create a vehicle to assist the Yazidi community globally and taking steps towards rebuilding their society. By ensuring that Iraqi and international organisations investigate and prosecute those that have committed these terrible crimes, we can go some way to assisting in this process. Justice needs to be delivered for the Yazidi, and those that undertook these atrocities must be brought to account no matter where they are in the world. And can I say that I think it is important that this Parliament recognise genocides such as those that the Yazidi have suffered. It's an important message to the rest of the world, to the world community, that the international legal and global order will not ever tolerate this type of actions. And I look forward to the day when this Parliament can consider a similar motion in relation to that long and deeply felt genocide that was perpetrated against the Armenians 100 years ago. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank the member for his contribution and give the call to the member for Eden-Monaro.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member for Dunkley for bringing forward this motion. It is important not only as global citizens for what has been done to these Yazidi people, but also the dimension that actually conflates with Australia's responsibilities in relation to its own citizens, as has been referred to. But This, in effect, ticks the main boxes for the crime of genocide as defined by the Convention. Any intent to destroy in whole part a national, ethnic or racial or religious group, not only killing the members of that group, but also deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction, and also imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And certainly some of the more heinous activities that were committed in Iraq, in the Sinjar region against the Yazidis, almost defy belief in the terms of the extent to which they went to prevent future generations of Yazidis. But, you know, their problems went back to 2007, well before even this started, with some of the more radical Sunni elements that were there under al-Qaeda in Iraq, but particularly picked up pace, of course, when the Daesh forces took over the region where the Yazidi resided in August of 2014. And the activities that they perpetrated there were not only just mass killings, particularly men at the beginning of their operations, but also then they moved to a position where they tried to create forced conversions. And of course the consequence of not agreeing to a forced conversion meant death. And many hundreds of Yazidi men were just rounded up, taken away, gunned down, buried alive, and abandoned in mass graves. Of course, the women and girls were rounded up, and they were examined by gynecologists to determine whether they were virgins or pregnant. If they were virgins, they were immediately put into a slave market, handed off to the fighters, the IS fighters. The pregnant women were forced to have forced abortions performed on them. So we can only, it's just completely incomprehensible to us sitting in this room what those circumstances must have been like for them, and then to move into that situation of sexual slavery being passed from person to person. In fact, the sex market, the slave market that was conducted was largely conducted online or through the use of apps like Telegram, Facebook, WhatsApp. All of these were used as part of this market. Something like 3,000 women, it's estimated, were subjected to this as sex slaves. And for example, the cost of a virgin was something around $10,000, and other women would go for $2,000 or $3,000. This is horrifying to contemplate, that this was also done under the guise of adherence to a religious belief, purportedly. And so it not only identifies the fact there was this horrific genocide going on, but it is good to see that after all these decades of saying never again, that there was a reasonably quick response, not only to bring relief to the Yazidis who were trapped on Mount Sinjar, but also then to participate in the coalition and international effort to destroy Daesh, which has largely been successful in the conventional sense. But it's also good that we didn't weasel word our approach to this. It was accepted as a genocide quite early on. In fact, the US House of Representatives voted 393 to 0 to accept that definition in March 2016, which contrasts greatly to what happened in Rwanda. So I'm pleased to see that we are being a bit more forceful, more proactive, but I would add my endorsement to this concept of making sure that we're doing all we can to ensure the prosecution of those who return. And also to choke off the ideology and the ideological efforts and propaganda that happen in this country to promote our young people to go over to countries like this to commit these crimes. Unless we think this is all just on the Islamic side, I'd like to also point out we have groups like Antipodean Resistance. And just this very morning, a poster was placed upon my electorate office in Bega, a sophisticated produced poster by the fascist group Antipodean Resistance, with swastikas and caricature portraits of Jews, describing Jewish poison, and part of their program is to ask for or pursue the legalisation of the killing of Jews. And my wife is Jewish, of course, so that also added extra poignancy to it. But this is happening in our country, as well as what we've seen manifesting overseas. We have to be very proactive and forceful on this, and I commend the member for highlighting that prosecutorial aspect of this crime. Thank you.